The storm outside cracked with a sudden roar, rattling the windows of the small cafe. Inside, 8-year-old Leo pressed his palms tightly over his ears, rocking in his seat, his toy dinosaurs forgotten on the table. His father, Richard Delaney, froze. He had seen this before. Words never seemed to reach Leo when the world grew too loud. A familiar helplessness weighed on him, a reminder that all his wealth, all his influence, could not shield his son from moments like this. That's when a waitress quietly knelt beside Leo. Her name was Nia. No hesitation, no rush, just a calm presence meeting a child's storm. From her apron pocket, she drew a small notebook filled with drawings. One page showed a cartoon dinosaur breathing slowly, exhaling a gentle cloud. She placed it before Leo and spoke softly, "Let's try it together." Like a sleepy dragon. What she did in that moment would change not only Leo's life, but countless others. Richard Delaney was the kind of man who turned companies into empires. His name carried weight in boardrooms, his signature could shift markets, and his calendar was filled with meetings that most people would never dream of attending. From the outside, it looked like he had mastered life. A penthouse overlooking the city skyline. A fleet of cars. Endless invitations to the most exclusive gatherings. Success, at least on paper, seemed absolute. But at home, behind the glass walls of luxury, Richard faced a challenge that stripped him of all control. His son, Leo, had been diagnosed with autism at the age of 3. For years, Richard tried to approach fatherhood the way he approached business. By hiring the best experts, funding the most advanced therapies, and building a network of specialists. Yet nothing seemed to bridge the gap between him and his son. No deal could be negotiated to earn Leo's trust. No contract could guarantee his affection. Richard could build skyscrapers, but he couldn't build a direct path into his son's world. That was the quiet truth that haunted him. A man capable of moving millions with a single decision, yet unable to reach the boy sitting across the breakfast table each morning. Leo was 8 now, a bright child with a mind that raced along its own pathways. His world was filled with patterns and rituals that gave him comfort, order, and a sense of control. Dinosaurs were his constant companions. He carried small plastic ones everywhere, lining them up on tables, counters, even the edge of his bed at night. Each dinosaur had a name, a sound, a place in his carefully arranged universe. To others, it might have looked like simple play, but for Leo it was more than that. The dinosaurs were anchors, steadying him when noises grew overwhelming or when routines were interrupted. He would murmur their names under his breath, his gold-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose, his eyes fixed with intense concentration. It wasn't aimless, it was structure, his way of making sense of a world that often felt unpredictable. Richard would watch from a distance, trying to understand. He admired Leo's sharp memory, the way his son could recall details from books and movies most adults overlooked. Yet admiration always mixed with frustration. Richard longed for a connection beyond observation. He wanted to step into Leo's world, not just watch it from across the room. But no matter how many toys he bought, no matter how many therapists he hired, the space between them remained. Leo had built a safe world for himself, and Richard stood at the edges, unable to cross over. Leo was 8 now, a bright child with a mind that raced along its own pathways. His world was filled with patterns and rituals that gave him comfort, order, and a sense of control. Dinosaurs were his constant companions. He carried small plastic ones everywhere, lining them up on tables, counters, even the edge of his bed at night. Each dinosaur had a name, a sound, a place in his carefully arranged universe. To others, it might have looked like simple play, but for Leo it was more than that. The dinosaurs were anchors, steadying him when noises grew overwhelming or when routines were interrupted. He would murmur their names under his breath, his gold-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose, his eyes fixed with intense concentration. It wasn't aimless, it was structure, his way of making sense of a world that often felt unpredictable. Richard would watch from a distance, trying to understand. He admired Leo's sharp memory, the way his son could recall details from books and movies most adults overlooked. Yet admiration always mixed with frustration. Richard longed for a connection beyond observation. He wanted to step into Leo's world, not just watch it from across the room. But no matter how many toys he bought, no matter how many therapists he hired, the space between them remained. Leo had built a safe world for himself, and Richard stood at the edges, unable to cross over. Evenings were the hardest. Richard would return from his office, loosen his tie, and walk through rooms that echoed with silence. Leo was usually in his corner of the living room, dinosaurs arranged in perfect order, the glow of a small lamp illuminating his quiet play. Richard would sit nearby, hoping for a glance, a word, anything to bridge the space between them. Sometimes hours would pass with only the sound of Leo softly naming his dinosaurs. For a man celebrated for his leadership, the absence of connection cut deeply. Colleagues spoke of him as decisive, charismatic, unshakable. Yet in the presence of his son, he felt small, unsure, almost invisible. Wealth had insulated Richard from many of life's challenges, but fatherhood proved to be the one place where no advantage applied. The loneliness was sharpest during milestones he knew he was missing. Birthday parties where other children laughed and played freely, school events where parents exchanged knowing smiles. Richard often found himself watching other fathers tossing balls with their sons in the park, a simple joy that felt impossibly out of reach. Inside, he carried a quiet ache. He wanted not just to provide for Leo, but to be known by him, to share in his world. Yet despite every effort, that bond remained fragile, leaving Richard with the haunting realization that love alone was not enough to create understanding. Richard often told himself that time would solve everything. That one day, Leo would simply look up, meet his eyes, and speak the words he longed to hear. "Dad, I need you." Yet the years passed, and that day never came. The gap remained, no matter how many specialists he paid or programs he enrolled his son in. His wealth could unlock private schools with sensory-friendly classrooms. It could cover therapists with the most polished resumes. It could purchase every educational tool on the market. Yet in the quiet of his home, with his son sitting only a few feet away, Richard still felt powerless. Money could build walls of glass and steel, but it could not build a bridge into Leo's inner world. That truth weighed heavily on him. For a man who thrived on solving problems, fatherhood had become the one challenge without a clear path forward. It was a test of patience, humility, and endurance that no deal could win. What Richard needed wasn't another expert or another program. He needed someone who could see Leo not as a diagnosis, but as a child with a voice waiting to be heard. That was the one thing his fortune could never buy. And he had no idea that the answer would arrive not from a clinic or a classroom, but from an unexpected corner of everyday life. The rain had grown steady by the time Richard guided Leo across the narrow street. Drops streaked down the glass towers surrounding his company headquarters, but just a block away, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore, stood a cafe with a hand-painted sign that read Harmony Grounds. Its windows glowed warmly against the gray afternoon, fogged slightly from the heat inside. Richard hesitated at the entrance. He was more accustomed to marble lobbies and uniformed doormen than chipped paint on a wooden door. The air inside was different too. No polished surfaces or designer lighting, just the aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread drifting through the room. Worn wooden tables were scattered in no particular order, and shelves along the wall displayed mismatched mugs donated by loyal customers. To the regulars, this small cafe was a second home. To Richard, it felt almost foreign. Too simple, too unpolished. Yet today wasn't about him. He had promised Leo a quiet outing, something away from the sterile waiting rooms of clinics and the polished perfection of luxury dining. Leo walked straight to a corner table, carefully setting his dinosaurs in a neat row as if the cafe itself had become his stage. Richard followed, loosening his grip on the umbrella, unaware that this modest place would soon mark one of the most important days of his life. The bell over the cafe door jingled softly as a waitress moved between tables with practiced ease. Her name was Nia Benson. At 27, she had been part of Harmony Grounds for 3 years, balancing long shifts with night classes in social work. To most customers, she was simply the woman who remembered their orders, who refilled cups before anyone had to ask. But those who paid attention noticed something more: her ability to make people feel at ease, as if she wasn't just serving coffee but listening to unspoken needs. Nia carried herself with quiet confidence, a warm smile lingering at the edges of her expression. Her coworkers joked that she was the cafe's anchor, the one who kept things steady when days grew hectic. Yet her strength wasn't loud or commanding. It was subtle, the kind that made strangers feel noticed in a world that often hurried past them. As she glanced toward the corner table, her eyes rested on Leo. Unlike other patrons who might have dismissed his intense focus on toy dinosaurs as odd, she paused with genuine interest. She saw the careful lines he formed, the way his hands hovered with precision, his murmured words barely audible. To her, it wasn't strange. It was a glimpse into a child's order, a world shaped by patience and detail. Richard, meanwhile, was unaware that the woman carrying a tray of mugs across the cafe would soon step into his son's life in a way no expert had managed before. Richard ordered a black coffee at the counter, still feeling out of place in the casual hum of the cafe. While he waited, he stole glances at Leo in the corner. His son was lining up dinosaurs with deliberate care, their tails and heads forming a perfect row. The outside world, the chatter of customers, the scraping of chairs, barely existed for him. Nia, carrying her notepad, approached their table. She crouched slightly to Leo's level before addressing Richard, her tone calm and unhurried. Richard noticed the difference immediately. Most servers he encountered in upscale restaurants spoke to him first, ignoring whoever sat beside him. But Nia's first glance had been for Leo, and somehow that small gesture lodged itself in Richard's mind. Then the storm made itself known. A deep rumble rolled across the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the glass panes. The sudden sound shattered Leo's calm. He flinched, covered his ears, and began rocking forward and back, his face tightening with fear. Richard set down his cup and leaned in, whispering reassurances that had never worked before. His words spilled out too quickly, urgent but ineffective. The scene drew curious looks from nearby tables. Richard felt that familiar helplessness creep in, the weight of being unable to soothe his own child. His throat tightened, shame and frustration colliding as his son's distress grew sharper with each passing second. And then, without hesitation, Nia stepped closer, her presence steady, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. Nia knelt beside the table, careful not to startle Leo further. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she slipped a small notebook from the pocket of her apron, flipping it open with practiced ease. The pages were filled with simple drawings, stick figures, animals, and little symbols that she had sketched during her night classes. She turned to a page showing a cartoon dinosaur, its round belly expanding as it breathed in, a gentle cloud puffing out as it exhaled. She placed the notebook gently on the table, sliding it into Leo's line of sight. "Hey there, Leo," she said softly, her voice steady but light. "This one's a sleepy dragon. He takes big, slow breaths. Do you want to try it with me?" At first, Leo's rocking didn't stop. His eyes flicked to the drawing, then back to his dinosaurs, as if unsure whether to let someone else into his rhythm. Nia didn't rush. She demonstrated instead, lifting her shoulders as she breathed in deeply, then slowly letting the air escape, pointing back to the dragon on the page. After a moment, Leo's gaze settled on the drawing. His hands lowered slightly. Tentatively, he breathed in, shaky, uneven at first, but enough for Nia to nod with quiet encouragement. Another breath followed, a little steadier. The rocking slowed, his shoulders relaxed, and the tension in his face began to fade. Richard sat frozen, astonished. He had watched therapists, doctors, and teachers try countless strategies. Yet here, in a corner cafe, a waitress with a notebook had reached his son in less than a minute. Richard's throat tightened as he watched. For years, he had poured money into solutions that promised breakthroughs. Every attempt ended the same: brief progress followed by disappointment. He had braced himself for a lifetime of distance, of loving his son from the edges of his carefully constructed world. Yet here, in a place he had entered almost reluctantly, something was shifting before his eyes. Leo's small breaths came steadier now, his rocking almost gone. He reached for the notebook, touching the drawing of the dinosaur as though recognizing a friend. For the first time in weeks, Richard saw his son's shoulders soften, the storm inside him easing with the simplest of tools: patience, kindness, and a drawing on a page. Richard wanted to speak, wanted to thank Nia, to ask how she had known what to do, but the words caught in his chest. He realized he was holding his own breath, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the table. Nia didn't look for praise. She simply stayed at Leo's side until he let out one final deep breath, his fingers tracing the lines of the sleepy dragon. Then she smiled gently, her eyes meeting Richard's for just a moment. It wasn't a look of triumph, but of reassurance, as if to say, he's okay. He's always been okay. He just needed someone to meet him where he is. Richard blinked back the sting in his eyes. Years of effort, endless resources, and yet this ordinary afternoon had accomplished what he thought impossible. When Leo finally settled, Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For a long moment, he sat silently, studying the young woman who had stepped in so naturally. She wasn't wearing a professional badge or carrying a clipboard filled with treatment plans. She wasn't part of the long list of specialists whose services he had funded. Yet somehow she had managed to connect with his son in a way none of them ever had. Gathering himself, Richard rose from his chair. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the authority it carried in the boardroom. I don't know how you did that, but thank you. Nia stood, slipping the notebook back into her apron. It's no trouble, she replied. Her tone was gentle, but not dismissive. She wasn't brushing off the importance of what had just happened. She simply treated it as natural, something any child deserved. Richard hesitated, realizing he didn't even know her name. I'm Richard Delaney, he offered. And that's my son, Leo. Nia, she said with a small smile. It's nice to meet you both. Richard nodded, still unsettled by the feeling that this meeting carried more weight than a simple introduction. Richard wasn't the type to linger in small cafes or make conversation with strangers, yet something compelled him to ask, "How did you know what to do back there?" Nia glanced toward Leo, who was once again arranging his dinosaurs, calmer now. My younger brother was diagnosed with autism when he was little, she explained. We didn't have the resources or support that families like yours might. I learned early on that sometimes the smallest adjustments, like visuals or a calm breathing exercise, make the biggest difference. Her words carried no bitterness, just quiet honesty. She went on, I started taking night classes in social work to better understand kids like my brother. The notebook. That's just something I've built over time. Little sketches, tools that might help when words don't. Richard listened, struck by the simplicity of her explanation. She wasn't presenting a polished theory or a formal treatment. She was speaking from lived experience, shaped by personal trial and the desire to help others. Nia shifted her tray to one side. I keep it with me at the cafe because you never know when you'll meet a child who needs a different kind of language. Sometimes pictures reach where words can't. For Richard, the realization landed with surprising force. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a sister, a student, and a quiet advocate armed with compassion and persistence. Richard found himself studying her more closely, not in the way a businessman sizes up a potential partner, but in the way a father notices someone who has managed to reach his child. There was no arrogance in her tone, no need to prove herself. Instead, there was steadiness, an assurance that came from lived experience and quiet determination. You did in 5 minutes what years of therapy couldn't, Richard admitted, his voice carrying more vulnerability than he intended. How is that possible? Nia shook her head. It's not magic. Leo already had the tools inside him. He just needed someone to offer them in a way that felt safe. Kids like your son, they're not unreachable. They just need patience and a little creativity. The simplicity of her answer unsettled Richard. He had grown accustomed to long reports, medical terms, and expensive treatment plans. Yet here stood a young woman who worked double shifts, paying her way through school, who had no glossy credentials to her name. Only a notebook filled with drawings and a heart committed to understanding. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt something shift inside him. Admiration, yes, but also humility. He realized he was standing before someone who embodied a wisdom wealth could never purchase. Richard remained at the table longer than he intended, asking questions not out of politeness but genuine curiosity. Each answer from Nia deepened his respect. She spoke about her brother with affection, about the challenges her family faced, and about her determination to make sure others wouldn't be left without guidance the way they once had been. It struck Richard that she never positioned herself as an expert. She didn't try to impress him with jargon or theory. Instead, she shared her experiences plainly, as someone who had walked the road herself. That sincerity carried more weight than any professional title ever could. As he listened, Richard recognized the irony. He had access to leaders in medicine, education, and psychology, yet it was a waitress in a neighborhood cafe who had broken through to his son. In her, he saw resilience born from hardship, creativity shaped by necessity, and empathy forged from love. By the time their conversation paused, Richard understood something important. Wisdom often reveals itself in the most unassuming places. He had spent years searching in boardrooms and clinics for solutions, never considering that the key to Leo's growth might come from someone the world would overlook. And so, a seed was planted that afternoon, not just in Leo's progress, but in Richard's heart, where admiration began to take root alongside humility. After that first afternoon at Harmony Grounds, Richard couldn't shake the memory of what he had witnessed. He replayed the image in his mind, Leo's tense shoulders loosening, his small hands settling, the quiet rhythm of his breathing returning under Nia's gentle guidance. For years, he had longed for such a moment, and now he wondered if it had been more than chance. A few days later, Richard returned to the cafe. He found Nia behind the counter, balancing plates and mugs with practiced ease. When the rush of customers subsided, he approached her with a question that carried more vulnerability than his usual tone. "Would you consider spending time with Leo outside the cafe? Not as a job, but as someone who seems to understand him." Nia hesitated, surprised, but not unwilling. She explained her schedule: long shifts, night classes, family obligations, but she agreed to meet with Leo a few afternoons each week. "If it helps him feel more comfortable," she said, "I'd be glad to try." Richard felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. It wasn't the kind born of polished brochures or glossy programs. This hope came from a young woman whose strength was rooted in empathy rather than credentials. And so began a new chapter in their lives. One built not on contracts or transactions, but on trust. Their first meeting outside the cafe took place in Richard's spacious apartment, though Nia quickly noticed how stark it felt for a child. Clean lines, expensive decor, but little warmth. She brought with her a small tote bag, filled not with gadgets or structured plans but with colored pencils, markers, and thick sheets of paper. Leo sat at the table, his dinosaurs lined up neatly in front of him. Nia joined him, spreading the paper across the surface without interrupting his ritual. She began sketching, not elaborate pictures, but simple outlines of dinosaurs. She left some unfinished, the shapes open-ended. "Do you want to help me finish this one?" she asked, sliding the page gently toward him. Leo's eyes flicked from his toys to the page. After a pause, he picked up a green pencil and filled in the spikes along the dinosaur's back. Nia didn't rush or correct. She added a tree beside it, then handed him another color. Soon they were working side by side, building a landscape of creatures, trees, and skies. Richard watched from the doorway, stunned. For years, art had been suggested by therapists, but it always felt forced, with structured tasks and rigid goals. Here, with Nia, it unfolded naturally, an exchange without pressure, where Leo's imagination led the way. For the first time, Richard heard his son let out a quiet laugh when Nia jokingly drew a dinosaur with glasses. It was small, fleeting, but for Richard it was a breakthrough. On another afternoon, Nia arrived carrying a small portable speaker and a handful of rhythm instruments. Simple things like maracas, a tambourine, and a small wooden drum. Richard had his doubts. Music had never been part of Leo's therapies. Most specialists believed structured exercises were more effective than open expression. Still, He watched with cautious curiosity. Nia placed the instruments on the rug and sat cross-legged beside them. She pressed play on the speaker, and a soft melody filled the room. Then she picked up the tambourine and tapped it lightly, keeping time with the beat. Leo, who had been lining his dinosaurs nearby, turned his head toward the sound. His fingers hovered over the toys, then slowly drifted to the maracas. He shook them once, hesitant, testing, and then again, this time in rhythm with the music. Nia smiled, matching his pace. "That sounds great, Leo," she encouraged. "Never too loud, never overwhelming." She followed his lead, letting him guide the rhythm. Soon, the two were playing together, the room alive with sound that was neither chaotic nor structured. It was simply theirs. For Richard, the effect was profound. He saw his son not only calm but engaged, sharing a moment without needing words. He realized that music wasn't just sound, it was communication, a bridge that carried Leo from isolation into connection. When the song ended, Leo clapped the maracas together and let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a squeal. Richard caught himself smiling too, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Nia never arrived without her notebook. The same tool that had helped Leo in the cafe soon became a staple in their afternoons together. One day, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Richard tensed, bracing for the usual wave of panic. But Nia calmly pulled out the notebook, already flipping to the page Leo had come to recognize, the sleepy dragon. She knelt beside him. "Remember our dragon breaths?" she asked, tracing the cartoon's outline with her finger. Leo pressed his palms against his ears, eyes darting nervously, but he peeked at the page. Nia demonstrated, breathing in deeply, then out slowly, her shoulders rising and falling in rhythm. Leo hesitated, but then he mirrored her. Inhale. Exhale. Again. To reinforce the rhythm, Nia pulled a small pinwheel from her bag, a simple toy she had bought on her way over. "Let's help the dragon make the wheel spin," she said. She placed it in front of Leo, and when he blew, the bright blades turned gently. His lips curled into the faintest smile. Richard exhaled with relief. He had always tried to reason with Leo during meltdowns, filling the silence with hurried words. Nia, by contrast, offered tools, visual cues, games, small rituals that turned moments of chaos into opportunities for calm. Over time, the notebook and the pinwheel became more than distractions. They were anchors, reminders that Leo had ways to soothe himself, and that someone believed he could. Weeks passed, and the changes were subtle but unmistakable. Leo, once withdrawn into his own rituals, began opening windows into his world. During art sessions, he started handing Nia specific colors, almost as if inviting her to share in his vision. During music time, he no longer waited. He reached for the maracas before she even pressed play. Even the breathing exercises, once foreign, became something he initiated when thunder or sudden noises unsettled him. One afternoon, as Nia traced a new drawing in her notebook, Leo giggled. It was small, fleeting, but it stopped Richard in his tracks. He hadn't heard that sound in months, maybe longer. It wasn't forced. It wasn't coaxed out by a therapist with a structured prompt. It was natural, born from trust. Richard began doing more than watching. He sat on the floor with them, awkward at first, unsure of his place in these activities. But Nia welcomed him without instruction, simply including him in the flow. When Leo reached for the pinwheel, Nia gestured for Richard to join in. Together, father and son blew softly, the blade spinning faster as Leo grinned. For the first time, Richard felt he wasn't standing outside looking in. He was part of Leo's rhythm, sharing laughter instead of longing for it. The breakthroughs weren't measured in charts or reports. They lived in moments like these, where love and patience carried more power than any treatment plan. The more time Richard spent alongside Nia and Leo, the more he realized how much he had to unlearn. For years, he believed that progress could be purchased, that the right expert, the right program, the right facility would eventually deliver the connection he craved. But Nia showed him something radically different. Progress wasn't a product, it was a relationship. It wasn't about forcing results. It was about listening, waiting, and meeting Leo where he was. Richard began to slow down. Instead of rushing to fill silences, he let them breathe. Instead of correcting Leo's routines, he joined them, lining dinosaurs in neat rows, giving each one a name as his son had taught him. He learned to celebrate small victories. A shared laugh, a gentle touch on the arm, a moment of eye contact. Each one felt like a gift, not a milestone to be charted. Watching Nia, Richard couldn't help but admire her resilience. She balanced her studies, her shifts, her family, and still carried enough patience to guide his son with compassion. Her strength was quiet but undeniable. She was teaching him as much as she was teaching Leo. One evening, as he reflected on the changes in his home, Richard felt something he hadn't in years. Gratitude. Not for his wealth, not for his success, but for the simple truth that sometimes the right person can change everything. What do you think? Could the world use more people like Nia? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. The weeks of watching Nia with Leo stirred something in Richard that went beyond gratitude. He was a man used to identifying potential in markets, in designs, in leaders who could transform companies. For the first time, he saw that same spark in a person outside the corporate world. Nia had no title, no position of power, yet she carried something far more valuable: the ability to connect where others could not. One evening, after Leo had drifted off to sleep, Richard asked Nia to stay a little longer. They sat at the dining table, the city lights flickering through the windows behind them. "You've given my son something no amount of money has ever bought," he said. "But it's more than that. What you're doing shouldn't just stay between you and Leo. It could help families everywhere." Nia shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just doing what I know," she said. "I don't have credentials. I'm not a doctor or a specialist. I'm still in school." "That's exactly why it matters," Richard replied. "You don't hide behind theory. You've lived it, you've practiced it, and it works. I want to help you share it on a larger scale." For the first time in years, Richard wasn't thinking about profits or shareholders. He was thinking about impact, about building something that could change lives far beyond his own family. Nia listened carefully, but her hands remained folded in her lap, her expression uncertain. "Richard, people like me don't start foundations," she said. "I work shifts at a cafe and take classes at night. If I walked into a room of experts and told them I had a better way, they'd laugh me out the door." Her words carried no self-pity, only realism. She had faced enough doubt in her life to know how quickly people dismissed a young black woman without credentials. The thought of standing before professionals, teachers, and parents as a supposed authority filled her with unease. Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "I've spent my life building companies out of nothing more than ideas. People doubted me too. They doubted every project until they couldn't ignore the results. You have something more powerful than any degree. You have proof that what you do works. I've seen it. My son is living evidence. Nia glanced toward the hallway, where Leo's soft hum carried faintly from his room. Her resistance wavered. She had never sought recognition. Her mission was personal, rooted in love for her brother and children like him. But now, the possibility of turning that quiet mission into something larger pressed against her doubt. Maybe, she admitted softly, but I wouldn't even know where to start. Richard smiled faintly at her hesitation. That's where I can help. I know how to build structures, raise funds, gather people. But the heart of it, the methods, the vision, that comes from you. Nia considered his words, her brow furrowed. If it were to exist, it couldn't just be another program for families who can already afford help. It would need to reach ordinary people. The teachers, the cafe workers, the bus drivers. Everyday encounters can be overwhelming for kids like Leo. What if we trained communities to understand better? To respond with patience instead of judgment? Her eyes brightened as she spoke, as if the idea surprised even her. Richard leaned in, recognizing the spark of possibility. You're describing a bridge, he said. Something that connects two worlds. Children and families who often feel isolated, and the rest of society that doesn't always know how to respond. That's the name, the Bridge Initiative. Nia repeated the phrase slowly, testing it on her tongue. The Bridge Initiative, she said again, this time with more certainty. It wasn't polished or corporate sounding, but it carried the weight of their vision. A movement that didn't belong to experts alone, but to communities willing to learn compassion in simple, practical ways. For the first time, Nia allowed herself to smile. The name felt right. The first steps toward launching the Bridge Initiative were far from smooth. Richard, used to boardrooms bending to his vision, encountered resistance almost immediately. His executives questioned why a successful CEO would pour resources into what they considered a side project. It's not scalable, one argued. There's no return on investment, another pointed out. To them, philanthropy was acceptable as long as it carried prestige. But training waitstaff and community workers to support autistic children didn't fit the mold. Outside the company, skepticism was even sharper. When Nia shared her methods in small gatherings, some professionals dismissed her. You're not trained, they said bluntly. What you're describing is simplistic. Real progress requires formal therapy. Their words stung, confirming her deepest fear, that her voice would be brushed aside before it had the chance to grow. But Richard refused to step back. He had seen the impact firsthand, and no amount of credentials could erase what he had watched with his own son. This is not about replacing experts, he told the doubters. It's about equipping everyday people to make small moments manageable. That's where real change begins. Each rejection only strengthened his resolve, and though Nia wrestled with doubt, she continued, encouraged by the families who approached her after workshops to say, "This helped us. Please keep going." The early months of the Bridge Initiative were marked by long hours, small gatherings, and plenty of doubt. Sometimes only a handful of people attended their sessions. A teacher here, a parent there, a neighbor curious to learn. Nia worried constantly that they weren't reaching enough people. Compared to polished conferences and established organizations, their efforts felt small, fragile. But Richard reminded her of something he knew from business. Every great venture begins at a scale others overlook. "We don't need thousands today," he said. "We just need to reach the ones who show up." Change spreads person to person. Slowly, those first few participants began to share their experiences. A teacher reported fewer meltdowns in her classroom after using Nia's visual aids. A cashier spoke about recognizing signs of sensory overload in a child at the store and responding with patience instead of judgment. Word began to travel, not in headlines, but in conversations among families and communities. For Nia, those stories mattered more than the skeptic's doubts. They reminded her that transformation wasn't measured by numbers alone, but by lives touched in everyday spaces. What began as hesitation was now becoming conviction. Their vision was real, and it was worth fighting for. Together, Richard and Nia pressed forward, holding on to faith in small beginnings. What once felt impossible was slowly, steadily, proving itself possible. The first workshops for the Bridge Initiative were held in borrowed community centers and school gyms. There were no glossy banners, no elaborate stages, just folding chairs, handouts printed on Richard's office copier, and Nia standing nervously at the front of the room. The groups were small at first. A handful of parents curious to learn, a few teachers hoping for new strategies, even a store clerk who admitted he wanted to understand how to help children who came through his checkout line. For Nia, every face felt significant, even if the room was only half full. She began simply, sharing her notebook, the same one she had once used with Leo. She explained how visual cues could calm a child overwhelmed by noise, how breathing exercises could become rituals of safety, how patience often mattered more than perfection. To her relief, people leaned in. They weren't looking for textbook answers. They wanted practical tools for daily life. After the sessions ended, parents lingered. Some asked questions, others thanked her quietly. One mother pulled her aside and whispered, "You just gave me something I can try tonight. That means more than you know." The workshops were humble, far from the polished conferences hosted by experts, but they carried a spark. For the first time, Nia believed this idea, this bridge, could stretch further than she had dared imagine. Among the early families who attended was Grace, a single mother raising her son, Carlos. At 9 years old, Carlos was nonverbal, withdrawn, and often overwhelmed in public spaces. Grace carried years of exhaustion in her posture, the kind born from constant worry and endless appointments that rarely brought progress. She listened carefully during one of Nia's workshops, her eyes widening when Nia demonstrated communication cards. Simple illustrations that gave children a way to express themselves without words. The cards showed pictures of everyday needs: food, drink, comfort, rest. Sometimes, Nia explained, children don't speak because the world hasn't given them a language they feel safe using. This can be their first step. Grace left that night clutching a small starter pack of cards. Weeks later she returned, tears brimming as she shared what had happened. Carlos had picked up the card for hungry, then another for water. Soon he began combining gestures with the cards, and one afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, he looked at her, placed a card down, and spoke a single word, "Mom." The room fell silent as Grace recounted the moment. Her voice shook, but her joy was unmistakable. "It was the first time I've ever heard him say it," she whispered. For Nia, the story felt like confirmation. The cards weren't just tools, they were lifelines unlocking voices long buried. And for Richard, it was proof that what started with Leo could ripple outward, touching lives he had never met. Grace's story spread quickly among the small circles attending the workshops, and soon others stepped forward with their own experiences. A kindergarten teacher shared how a student who often hid under his desk during lessons began participating after she introduced a simple breathing ritual Nia had demonstrated. "It's not complicated," the teacher said. "We breathe in together, we breathe out together. He's calmer, and the rest of the class is calmer too." Another testimony came from a cashier at a local grocery store. She described how a boy in her checkout line once covered his ears and began to cry as the beeping scanners grew too loud. Instead of rushing the family through, she remembered Nia's advice: lower the pace, reduce the noise, and give the child space. "It only took a minute," she said, "but the mother looked at me like I had given her a gift." Even community workers, bus drivers, librarians, youth coaches, started to share their successes. They weren't solving everything, but they were turning difficult moments into manageable ones, offering dignity and understanding where before there had only been impatience. Each testimony added weight to what Richard already knew. Small adjustments, when practiced with empathy, could transform lives. The initiative wasn't delivering miracles. It was equipping ordinary people to make daily interactions less frightening and more humane. And in those testimonies, Nia found courage to stand taller, realizing that her notebook sketches and lived experience were fueling a movement larger than she had ever imagined. What began as small gatherings soon stretched into something bigger. Parents who found value in the workshops told their friends, and schools started reaching out to request sessions for their teachers. A community center in another city invited Nia to speak, and to her surprise, the room filled beyond capacity. Word of mouth was carrying the Bridge initiative faster than Richard had anticipated. With growth came structure. Richard used his business acumen to secure venues, build partnerships, and ensure funding remained stable. He treated the project with the same seriousness he gave his company, drawing on his network to open doors that would have otherwise remained closed. Nia, meanwhile, became the heart of every session. Her presentations weren't polished speeches but heartfelt conversations, grounded in personal stories and practical strategies. Parents trusted her because she spoke their language, not the language of textbooks. Teachers valued her because she respected their challenges. Community workers listened because she showed them they were part of the solution. Together, Richard and Nia formed an unlikely partnership: the seasoned CEO and the waitress-turned-student. His strength was strategy. Hers was connection. He built the Bridges framework, but she filled it with humanity. As demand grew, so did their sense of responsibility. What had started as one moment in a cafe was now a growing movement, expanding far beyond what either of them had envisioned. And with every testimony, every breakthrough, the conviction deepened. They were building something the world desperately needed. For Richard, the greatest transformation wasn't in boardrooms or workshops but in his own home. Years earlier, he had tried to force progress with Leo, filling silence with words, replacing distance with expensive programs. Now he was learning something radically different: patience. Evenings no longer felt like quiet battles. Instead of sitting apart from Leo, he joined him. He crouched on the carpet and lined up dinosaurs exactly as his son arranged them, head to tail, tail to head, without trying to change the order. At first, Leo ignored him, focused on his ritual. But over time, he began sliding one dinosaur toward his father, a quiet invitation that Richard accepted with reverence. It was in those small exchanges that Richard discovered what he had been missing all along. Connection wasn't about pulling Leo into his own world. It was about stepping into Leo's. He learned to celebrate each shared glance, each fleeting smile, each small hand guiding his own. Richard's identity had always been tied to control. Leading teams, driving profits, shaping outcomes. But with Leo, he learned the value of surrender, of letting progress unfold at its own pace. For the first time, fatherhood felt less like failure and more like discovery. The bond he once thought impossible was slowly, patiently, becoming real. While Richard was changing at home, Nia was transforming in her own right. For years, she had balanced long hours at the cafe with night classes, inching slowly toward a social work degree. The Bridge Initiative shifted that balance. With Richard's support, she reduced her shifts and focused fully on her studies, determined to ground her lived experience in formal knowledge. Her professors noticed. Papers that once blended into stacks began standing out, thoughtful, rooted in both theory and practice. Her classmates, many of whom came from traditional academic paths, were drawn to her stories. She wasn't speaking from textbooks alone. She was speaking from lived encounters with children and families. Outside the classroom, her reputation grew as well. Invitations to speak at schools, community gatherings, and parent groups multiplied. At first, she doubted whether she belonged on those stages. But when she saw the way audiences leaned in, parents nodding, teachers taking notes, she realized her voice carried weight. Recognition followed, not because she sought it, but because her sincerity left an impression. What had once been dismissed as just a waitress was now respected as leadership. She wasn't simply helping families. She was shaping a movement. Still, Nia remained grounded. She carried her notebook everywhere, filled with sketches and ideas. To her, it was a reminder that transformation didn't start with applause. It started with small drawings, a calm voice, and the willingness to kneel beside a child who needed understanding. Though their lives had taken very different paths, Richard and Nia found themselves bound by a shared mission. There was no romance between them, no storyline of unlikely love. What tied them together was deeper, a recognition that empathy and persistence could reshape lives, starting with one frightened boy in a cafe. Richard had been redeemed not by wealth or power, but by learning to meet his son with patience. He became less of the untouchable executive and more of the father Leo needed. He still led companies, but his greatest pride no longer came from quarterly reports. It came from hearing Leo's laugh, from joining him in small rituals, from knowing that their bond was finally taking root. Nia, meanwhile, had stepped into a role she never envisioned. The girl who once feared being underestimated now stood before crowded rooms with confidence. She hadn't left her roots behind. She still supported her family, still carried the same notebook, but she had embraced the truth that her lived experience was not a weakness. It was her greatest strength. Together, they demonstrated that transformation doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from one person willing to notice, and another willing to believe. The Bridge Initiative was proof of that. So too were the lives they had each rebuilt, Richard as a father, Nia as a leader. Their stories converged in a partnership that crossed boundaries of class, race, and privilege, reminding everyone who heard it that humanity itself is the greatest bond. A decade after that rainy afternoon, the Bridge Initiative had grown far beyond its modest beginnings in borrowed classrooms and community centers. What started with a notebook and a handful of families had become a nationwide presence. Dozens of cities now hosted workshops, each tailored to local needs but built on the same foundation: patience, empathy, and practical tools for everyday encounters. Annual conferences brought together educators, parents, medical professionals, and, most importantly, individuals on the autism spectrum themselves. Instead of being spoken about, they spoke for themselves, sharing insights that shaped new training programs. The initiative had become more than a charity. It was a movement where lived experience guided learning. Schools adopted Nia's visual aids, restaurants trained staff in her methods, and public libraries created sensory-friendly spaces modeled after her recommendations. The impact wasn't confined to children. It spread to families, teachers, and entire communities. Richard, once skeptical that ordinary people could be agents of change, now stood proudly beside Nia at these events, not as her benefactor but as her partner in vision. What he had once seen as a small act of kindness had transformed into a legacy that carried weight across the nation. Through it all, Leo remained at the heart of the story. By 13, he was taller, his frame lanky and still a little awkward, but his love for dinosaurs had never faded. Shelves in his room overflowed with figurines, books, and drawings, each one arranged with the same care he had shown as a child. Yet there was more to him now. The boy who once hid behind routines had begun to step into the world with greater confidence. With Nia's tools and his father's newfound patience, Leo discovered ways to express himself that felt safe. He still preferred order, still sought comfort in familiar patterns, but he had also found moments of joy in sharing them. In school, teachers trained through the Bridge Initiative noticed his strengths: an incredible memory for details, an ability to recognize patterns others overlooked, and a sharp sense of humor when he chose to share it. At home, he laughed more, spoke more, and leaned into the small rituals that now included his father as a full participant. Leo hadn't been changed into someone else. He was simply more himself, supported in ways that allowed his voice to grow louder. And for Richard, that was the greatest success of all. Not fixing his son, but finally knowing him. Over the years, Richard and Nia's partnership became a story in itself. To outsiders, they seemed an unlikely pair, a millionaire CEO and a former waitress balancing work and school. Yet their differences were exactly what gave the Bridge Initiative its strength. Richard understood systems, funding, and influence. Nia understood people, families, and the subtle ways kindness could transform a moment. They came from opposite ends of society. Different races, different economic backgrounds, different life experiences. But together, they demonstrated that empathy does not recognize those divisions. Their collaboration became a visible reminder that true change happens when barriers fall and people choose to meet each other with respect. At conferences, Richard often stood back, allowing Nia to lead the sessions. He knew the movement didn't rest on his wealth or name. It rested on the authenticity she carried. And in turn, Nia never forgot that Richard's belief in her had helped open doors she might never have crossed alone. Their story became less about who they were individually and more about what they represented together. Proof that when privilege aligns with compassion, and when resilience meets opportunity, lives are reshaped. Looking back, it was astonishing how much had grown from one small encounter. Neither Richard nor Nia could have planned it, and neither would have believed that a moment so ordinary could spark something so enduring. Yet every milestone, the conferences, the workshops, the testimonies, traced its roots to that single afternoon in a corner cafe. Richard often repeated the line when asked about the origin of the initiative. It all began with a rainy afternoon, a scared little boy, and a waitress who refused to look away. That phrase captured more than just a memory. It carried the essence of their mission. the belief that even the smallest acts of empathy can create legacies far greater than anyone imagines. Today, the Bridge Initiative continues to grow, not as Richard's project or Nia's alone, but as a shared movement. It belongs to the parents who use the tools, the teachers who adapt classrooms, the children who find safety in new rituals, and the communities who learn to welcome them. Leo remains the quiet reminder of why it all began. His laughter, his steady presence, his dinosaurs lined neatly on a shelf, all testify to the power of being seen, understood, and accepted. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Milton Stories, because every share, every like, and every comment helps us spread the power of empathy to more people.